It was a cold October morning in a quiet suburb of Asheville, North Carolina. The trees had already started shedding their leaves, leaving the sidewalks scattered in orange and brown. Betty Sullivan, 73, wrapped in her wool cardigan, stepped out for her daily walk. Since losing her husband 8 years ago, these walks were more than habit, they were her therapy. But that morning, something stopped her in her tracks. Just off the walking path, curled tightly on a patch of damp grass, was a large German shepherd, thin and trembling. In his paws, he clutched an old, worn-out teddy bear. Betty's breath caught in her throat. The dog wasn't aggressive. In fact, he didn't move at all. Just stared at her with eyes so deep and heavy they seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime. She stepped closer, slowly. His fur was matted, his ribs visible, but it was the teddy bear that made her chest ache. The toy was torn, patched with old stitches and missing an ear. She crouched beside him and softly whispered, "Where did you come from, sweet boy?" The dog didn't flinch. Instead, he gently nudged his nose against her hand, as if he had been waiting for someone to notice him. She couldn't walk away. Carefully, she removed the scarf from her neck and wrapped it around the dog's body. He allowed it, never letting go of the teddy bear. "Come on now," she said softly, her voice cracking. "Let's get you warm." The dog followed her home without a sound, limping slightly on one leg. She named him Beau, short, gentle, fitting. Back on her front porch, she made a bed of old towels and blankets. Beau lay down, clutching the bear, and let out the deepest sigh she'd ever heard. That night, Betty sat at her kitchen table, sipping lukewarm tea, unable to stop thinking about Beau. There was something in his silence, something tragic and tender. She didn't sleep much. In the morning, she loaded him into her old station wagon and drove to the local vet, Dr. Raymond Clark, a kind man with silver hair and gentle eyes who had treated her late cat years ago. Dr. Clark examined Beau and scanned him for a microchip. "He's chipped," he said, surprised. "Looks like his name is Beau. All right, full name registered as Beau, owned by the Mitchell family, Jim and Linda Mitchell. They had a son named Danny." Betty leaned in, her heart suddenly racing. Dr. Clark paused. "But Betty, that chip was last updated over 3 years ago, and the file, it's marked as inactive. Something happened." Betty felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Back at home, Betty sat on her front porch rocker, Beau resting beside her on the makeshift bed, the teddy bear still tucked tightly between his paws. The breeze was crisp, the kind that carried more than just cold, it carried memories. She couldn't stop thinking about what Dr. Clark had said. Inactive file, last updated 3 years ago. Something about that phrasing gnawed at her. Who were the Mitchells? And what had happened to make them disappear from a life that once included Beau? Beau wasn't just a stray. He had once belonged to someone who clearly loved him. That bear, it wasn't just a toy. It was a memory, something he refused to let go of. Betty watched him sleep, occasionally twitching or whimpering softly in his dreams. It reminded her too much of her late husband in his final years. Restless, haunted by things unspoken. She reached down, gently brushing Beau's ear. "We'll figure it out," she whispered. "You're not alone anymore." Later that afternoon, Betty called the number listed in the chip record, not really expecting anyone to answer. To her surprise, the line connected. A woman's voice came through, weak and distant. "Hello." It was Linda Mitchell. Betty introduced herself and explained how she had found Beau. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Betty almost asked if she was still there. Then came the reply, barely a whisper. "You found Beau? He's alive." The woman's voice cracked. Betty felt the tremor through the phone. "I thought we'd lost him forever." There was something else in her voice, something deeper than relief, something closer to grief. Betty didn't push, but she offered to meet, if Linda felt comfortable. Another long silence, then, "I'll come by tomorrow. I need to see him. I owe him that much." That evening, Betty couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting would bring more than answers. Beau was restless again, pacing around the porch, sniffing the air like he sensed something coming. He didn't eat much, but he stayed close to Betty, as if clinging to the safety of her presence. The teddy bear never left his side. The way he guarded it, it was more than attachment. It was devotion. She wondered if the bear had belonged to Danny, the boy Dr. Clark had mentioned. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Betty stared out into the twilight, her hands wrapped around a mug of warm cider. She didn't know what story Linda would bring with her, but she could feel it. Whatever had happened to that family had left scars. And Beau, he was one of them, a silent witness to something no one had spoken about in years. Tomorrow she would hear the truth, or at least part of it. The next morning arrived with a sky wrapped in gray clouds and a stillness in the air that felt almost sacred. Betty woke early, nervous but composed. She'd set out a second chair on the porch, made a fresh pot of coffee, and placed a blanket near Beau's bedding. He had slept curled up as always, the worn teddy bear nestled against his chest like a sacred relic. Every so often, he would lift his head and sniff the wind, as if he knew today meant something. By mid-morning, a silver SUV pulled slowly into the gravel driveway. Betty rose from her chair as a woman stepped out. Linda Mitchell looked older than her voice had suggested. Early 50s, perhaps, but her face carried the weight of someone who had lived through too many sleepless nights. Her movements were cautious, her hands trembling as she clutched a framed photo close to her chest. "Is he?" she started, but her eyes had already found Beau. Beau didn't bark. He didn't move at first. He simply stared, ears perked, body tense. Then, like a switch had been flipped somewhere deep inside him, he stood. The teddy bear dropped from his mouth as he walked slowly toward her. Linda fell to her knees, eyes full of tears, arms open but unsure. "Beau," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of years lost. The dog reached her, stopped just inches away, then pressed his head gently into her chest. Linda collapsed forward, holding him like she'd never let go again. Betty watched from the porch, her eyes misted. She had seen grief before, raw and unfiltered, but there was something different here, something older, buried deep. Linda sat on the porch steps now, one arm still wrapped around Beau, as if afraid he'd vanish again. She finally spoke. "We lost Danny 3 years ago," she said quietly, not looking up. "He was 10. Beau was his best friend. They went everywhere together. That teddy bear? Danny gave it to Beau when he was just a pup." Betty's breath caught in her throat. She said nothing, letting the silence speak where words would fail. Linda continued, her voice hollow. "One night, Danny ran out into the road. Beau tried to stop him. They were hit by a car. Beau survived. Danny didn't." She paused, her hands gripping Beau's fur. "After the funeral, Beau ran off. We searched for months. But we thought he was gone too." The porch seemed to hold its breath. Beau lifted his head, looking between both women with those same deep, knowing eyes. Betty knelt beside them and gently placed a hand on Linda's back. "He came back for a reason," she said softly. "And maybe he's not the only one who needed to heal." The hours after Linda's visit passed in heavy silence. Betty had offered her lunch, but Linda had politely declined, saying she wasn't ready to eat, just to be near Beau. She sat on the porch for nearly an hour, stroking his fur and occasionally wiping away tears. Beau stayed beside her the entire time, his movements calm, deliberate, as if he too was afraid of breaking the fragile peace that had settled between them. When she finally left, she turned to Betty and said, "I need a little time, but thank you for giving him back to us." That night, Beau didn't curl up in his usual spot. Instead, he sat by the window, staring into the dark like he was waiting for something. Betty, watching from the kitchen, felt a chill crawl up her arms. There was something unsettling in the way he held his posture, alert but not tense. It was as if he were listening for a sound only he could recognize. The teddy bear lay untouched beside his bed for the first time since he arrived. Betty approached and gently placed it next to him. Beau didn't respond. Betty sat on the floor beside him. "You saw more than they know, didn't you?" she whispered. Beau finally looked at her, his eyes soft but haunted. She reached out and touched his paw. "You stayed with him, didn't you?" You tried to protect him." Her voice cracked. She didn't need an answer. She saw it in his face. That kind of loyalty left a mark. Betty knew. She had lived through a war, watched a husband die slowly, and buried friends. But there was something different about this. This was grief carried by an animal, silent and unresolved. The next morning, Betty drove back to Dr. Clark's clinic. She needed to know more. The vet welcomed her with a warm smile, already guessing the reason for her visit. "You're not the first person who's ever told me a dog remembers," he said gently. "But Beau, he's different. His stress levels are still elevated, even when he's calm. There's trauma locked in him, and it's not just the accident." Betty frowned. "Do you think he saw what happened? Could he remember details?" Dr. Clark nodded slowly. "It's possible. Dogs remember through patterns, smells, places. If Beau ever returned to the site of the accident or something familiar triggered it, he might react." He hesitated before continuing. "If you're thinking what I think you are, going back there, it could bring answers. Or it could reopen a wound." That afternoon, Betty sat back on her porch, Beau lying quietly at her feet. She looked down at him and whispered, "Beau, if there's more to this story, maybe it's time we both faced it." The dog lifted his head, as if understanding every word. The old country road was quiet, too quiet. The trees leaned in on both sides, their branches forming a tunnel of shadows and filtered light. Betty gripped the steering wheel tighter as the car rolled over the cracked pavement. Beau sat in the back seat, eyes fixed on the window, his body still but alert. She could feel the tension coming off him like static. This was it, the road where Danny had died. Linda had given her the location earlier that morning, hesitantly, almost warning her not to go. But Betty knew this wasn't just about answers. It was about closure. When she parked by the shoulder, Beau didn't wait. He leapt out of the car, sniffing the ground immediately. The wind carried the scent of pine, damp earth, and something else, something older. Betty followed slowly, her heart pounding. She watched as Beau moved with purpose, not randomly, but like he knew exactly where he was going. After about 50 feet, he stopped. It was a curve in the road, just before a steep drop. There was a worn patch of grass, a broken fence post, and the faint remains of old tire marks, now faded by time and rain. Beau stood still for a moment, then sat. He began to whimper, soft at first, then louder, almost like a cry. Betty's eyes welled up. She stepped closer and knelt beside him, resting a hand on his back. "This is where it happened, isn't it?" she whispered. Beau didn't look at her. His gaze was locked on the woods beyond the curve. Then, unexpectedly, he stood and walked toward the trees, pushing through the brush as if chasing something only he could see. Betty hesitated, then followed him in. They walked about 20 yards before Beau stopped again, this time in front of a cluster of stones. Something stuck out from beneath the leaves. A piece of torn fabric, sun-bleached but still visibly red. Betty crouched, brushing it off gently. It was a child's sweatshirt. The initials DM were stitched into the collar. Her breath caught. "Danny Mitchell," she whispered. She looked at Beau, who was now lying beside the fabric, his body curled tightly, eyes shut. He wasn't just mourning, he was remembering. Maybe he had chased Danny into these woods that night. Maybe Danny hadn't died instantly. Maybe Beau had stayed with him, waiting, until someone finally came. Or maybe no one ever did. Betty felt something inside her break. A grief that wasn't hers, but that she now carried. As the wind picked up, Betty stood and looked around. This wasn't just a memory, it was a message. Beau had led her here for a reason, and part of her was starting to suspect. There was more to Danny's story than anyone had told. Betty couldn't stop thinking about the red sweatshirt. Back home, it sat folded in a paper bag on her kitchen counter, carefully sealed in plastic. She hadn't told Linda about it yet. Something in her gut told her to wait. Not out of suspicion, but out of a need to understand. Why would Danny's sweatshirt still be out there after 3 years? If the accident had truly happened on the road, why was the boy's clothing deep in the woods, nearly hidden? And why hadn't anyone found it before? These were the kinds of questions that didn't let her sleep. That night, She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of decaf and her old reading glasses perched on her nose. She had pulled out her late husband's laptop and searched local news archives from 3 years ago. It didn't take long to find it. Boy killed in tragic accident. Dog missing after scene. The article was short, almost clinical. Danny Mitchell, 10, struck by a car on Maple Hollow Road while chasing after his dog, Beau. The driver remained unnamed. No foul play suspected. Betty leaned back in her chair. It all felt too clean, too convenient. The next morning, she visited Dr. Clark again, bringing Beau along. As they talked, she mentioned the sweatshirt and Beau's behavior in the woods. The vet looked troubled. "You know," he said slowly, "dogs don't run off for no reason. If Beau disappeared after the accident, it might have been because something wasn't right. Dogs are loyal to a fault. He wouldn't have just left unless he was scared or trying to lead someone to something." Betty nodded. That had been her feeling too. "Would you recognize trauma if it had human involvement?" she asked suddenly. Dr. Clark raised his eyebrows. "You mean abuse?" Betty hesitated, then nodded. "I don't think Danny just ran into the road, and I don't think Beau ran away. I think something happened that night. Something no one ever told Linda." The vet was quiet for a moment. "I can't prove anything," he said softly, "but I trust Beau's instincts over most people's memories." Back at home, Beau was restless again. He circled the porch, stopped at the window, then walked to the back of the house and sat facing the woods. Betty watched him closely. He wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for something unfinished. She sat beside him, resting her hand gently on his back. "What did you see, Beau?" she whispered. "What are you trying to show me?" As the sun set, casting long shadows over the yard, Betty made a decision. She would go back to Maple Hollow Road, this time with Linda, and she would show her the sweatshirt. Whatever secrets had been buried in those woods, they were starting to rise. And Beau, he remembered all of them. Linda sat on the porch swing, hands clenched tightly in her lap, staring at the worn wood of the floor. Betty had invited her back under the pretense of catching up, but both women knew there was something more waiting to be said. Beau lay between them, his head resting near Linda's feet, ears alert. Betty sat quietly beside them, letting the moment settle before she spoke. "I went to the road," she said gently. Linda didn't react, but her knuckles turned white. "Beau led me into the woods, and we found something." She reached for the paper bag at her side, slowly pulling out the plastic-wrapped piece of red fabric. Linda's eyes widened. "That's..." Her voice cracked. "That's Danny's sweatshirt." Her fingers hovered over the plastic, not touching it, but as if the mere sight of it burned. Betty nodded. It was buried under leaves, near a cluster of stones. Beau led me right to it. Silence fell again, thicker this time, like a fog they couldn't push through. Finally, Linda spoke, her voice shaking. "They told me he died instantly, on the road, that there was nothing they could do." Betty's eyes met hers. "I don't think that's what happened." She chose her words carefully, not out of fear of offending, but because she knew Linda had carried this wound for too long. "Beau didn't just run away. I think he stayed with Danny. I think something scared him. Something more than just an accident." Linda's face crumpled, tears forming in her eyes. She shook her head slowly. "Jim never wanted to talk about it. He said it was better to let it go. But there were things that never made sense. The way the car disappeared. The driver never spoke to me. Police said it was clean, but I always felt something was missing." Beau sat up now, his eyes fixed on Linda. He let out a low whine, pressing his head gently against her leg. She broke down then, sobbing into her hands, her body trembling. "I failed him," she whispered. "I didn't ask enough questions. I let people tell me how to grieve, how to move on. But I knew. Deep down, I knew it wasn't the whole truth." Betty put a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't fail him, Linda. You were grieving. You were trying to survive." As the evening light faded and the porch was wrapped in gold and blue shadows, the two women sat in silence, Beau lying between them, still as a statue. Whatever had happened that night, the truth had started to surface. And for the first time in years, Linda allowed herself to believe that maybe Danny hadn't been alone in his final moments. But now they had to find out who really was. Linda hadn't spoken to Jim in nearly 2 years. After Danny's death, something inside her husband had shifted, hardened. He stopped talking about their son, packed away every photo, and avoided any conversation that even hinted at the past. Eventually, their grief drove them apart. But after finding Danny's sweatshirt and hearing Betty's suspicions, Linda knew she had to face him. She needed to hear the story again. This time with her own questions, and with Beau there to help uncover what Jim had tried so hard to bury. She called him that evening. His voice was colder than she remembered, distant and tired. Still, he agreed to meet the next day at his small house on the outskirts of town. Betty insisted on going with her, and bringing Beau he remembers, she told Linda softly. And maybe, so will Jim. When they pulled into the driveway, Beau's ears perked up immediately. He stood at the edge of the seat, staring through the windshield at the front door, tail still, body alert. Jim opened the door with hesitation. He was grayer now, his face older than his years. When he saw Beau, his expression faltered for just a moment, like a crack in a mask. "You found him," he muttered. After all this time, Beau didn't move. He simply stared. Linda stepped forward, holding the plastic bag with Danny's sweatshirt. "I found this," she said, "in the woods, near the road." Jim's face went pale. He looked at the sweatshirt, then at Beau. That shouldn't be there." "That's exactly the problem," Betty said, stepping forward. "Jim, we need the truth. Not what the police said. Not what you told Linda. The truth." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and stared out the window. "I didn't lie," he said slowly. "But I didn't tell everything either." His voice dropped. "Danny chased Beau into the road. But it wasn't just any car. It was my truck. I had been drinking." The words landed like a punch to the chest. Linda gasped, stepping back. "You what?" Jim turned to her, eyes full of something between guilt and defeat. "I had gone out that night after a fight. I didn't even see them until it was too late. Panicked. Called a friend. They said the less I said, the better. The police ruled it an accident. I let them believe it." Beau let out a deep, low growl. Not angry, but mournful. He moved toward Jim, sniffed the air, then walked back to Linda and laid down at her feet. Betty looked at Jim, her voice firm. "You've carried this lie long enough." But Beau never forgot. And now, neither will we. The silence in Jim's living room was unbearable. Linda sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, her eyes red but dry now, past the point of shock. Betty stood by the window, arms crossed, trying to keep her breathing steady. Beau lay near the door, quiet, but watching, always watching. Jim remained by the kitchen counter, gripping the edge like it was the only thing keeping him upright. No one spoke for a long time. The truth had finally been spoken, but what came next felt even heavier. "I thought I was protecting you," Jim finally said, not looking at Linda. "I thought if you never knew, you could survive it. But it's been killing me ever since." His voice broke. "I see Danny every time I close my eyes. I hear the thud, the scream, Beau barking, and I see the look on his face when I backed away and drove off." Linda turned her head slowly, eyes narrowed. "You left him there," she whispered. "You left our son, alone, in the dark." Jim dropped into a chair, shoulders collapsing. "I didn't know what to do. I was drunk. I was scared. And I've lived in hell every day since." Beau stood now, moving toward him, but not in aggression. He sat a few feet away and stared directly into Jim's face. It was a gaze full of sorrow, not anger. A silent judgment that said everything without a single sound. Jim looked at the dog and whispered, "I'm sorry, Beau. I really am." Betty finally stepped forward. "You have to tell the truth, Jim. Not just to us. You owe it to Danny. And to yourself." Linda nodded, her voice still trembling. "We lost our son that night, but we also lost our family. All because of a lie. Jim covered his face with his hands, sobbing quietly. What will they do to me? What happens now? Betty's reply was calm, but firm. That's not up to us. What matters is that you stop hiding. Later that evening, back at Betty's house, Linda sat on the porch in silence. Beau lay beside her, his head resting in her lap, eyes finally closed in rest. Betty brought her a cup of tea and sat down. You did the right thing, she said softly, even when it hurt. Linda nodded. I don't know what's next, but I feel lighter, like Danny can finally rest. And maybe, so can Beau. As the wind moved gently through the trees and night settled over the porch, all three sat in silence. The storm had passed, but the air was still thick with memory. Tomorrow, Jim would turn himself in. But tonight, they allowed themselves one moment of peace. It had been 3 weeks since Jim walked into the sheriff's office and told the truth. The small town had reacted with shock and heartbreak. People remembered Danny Mitchell, the bright-eyed boy with the big smile and the loyal dog always by his side. Now they knew the full story. Jim faced charges, but more than that, he faced himself. And somehow, despite the pain, there was a sense of quiet respect in the way he accepted what he'd done. He didn't run this time. Linda, too, had changed. Her grief no longer looked like a closed room with no windows. She began to open drawers she hadn't touched in years. She brought Danny's old things out of storage, not to live in the past, but to honor it. His drawings, his books, and, of course, the photo of him holding Beau as a puppy, both of them smiling like they had all the time in the world. She placed it on the mantel right above the fireplace. Beau stayed with Betty. Linda visited often, but she believed Beau had found something sacred in that quiet house on the hill, a final place to rest, to be understood. He had been through too much to be shuffled around again. And Betty, she had changed too. After years of solitude, her heart had something to hold on to again. Purpose. A reason to wake early and sit quietly with a soul that understood pain without speaking it. Every afternoon, Betty and Beau took the same walk down the long trail behind the house. Sometimes they'd stop at the old oak tree, where Betty had placed a small stone etched with Danny's name. It wasn't an official memorial, just a marker. Something gentle. Beau always stopped there, too. He would sit quietly, ears alert, tail still. Betty never rushed him. She knew he needed those moments. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the sky in amber and rose, Betty sat on the porch with a blanket across her lap. Beau lay beside her, head resting gently on her foot. She looked down at him and smiled. You've carried more than any creature should ever have to, she whispered. But you're home now. You're safe. And you're loved. As the wind rustled the trees and a soft peace settled over the yard, Betty closed her eyes. Beau lifted his head just slightly, eyes scanning the horizon, then rested again. The past had not been erased, but it had been faced. The truth had broken them open, and in that breaking, something new had begun.